For 3 years, it sat untouched beneath a gray tarpaulin in the far corner of a salvage lot outside Phoenix, Arizona. The tarpaulin had long since stopped doing its job, corners frayed, a split running along one seam, letting in the dust and the dry desert heat season after season. Underneath it, a silver Aston Martin DB5 slowly surrendered itself to time. The chrome peeled, the leather cracked, the engine bay filled with grime so thick a man could write his name in it. Every certified appraiser who walked past it over those 3 years said the same thing without bothering to stop. Dead car, not worth the paperwork. The kind of thing you break down for scrap and sell by the pound. The auction house that owned the lot had it penciled in for removal before the end of the quarter. Nobody disputed that. Nobody except one man, and he was the man who swept the floors. Ethan Cole was 42 years old. He had a quiet face, a careful walk, and hands that knew their way around an engine the way a musician knows a keyboard. He wore the same gray work shirt every day, rolled the sleeves to the elbow, and moved through the garage at Hargrove Premier Auctions the way a shadow moves present, unremarkable, easy to ignore. The other staff rarely spoke to him beyond the necessary. He was the janitor. He fixed what broke, cleaned what spilled, and disappeared when the clients came through. Nobody asked about his background. Nobody cared. There was a coffee ring on the floor near Bay 3, and Ethan Cole was the man you called to deal with it. What they did not know, what they had never thought to ask, was that Ethan Cole had once been something else entirely. 12 years before he took that job at Hargrove, he had been a mechanical engineer at one of the most respected performance garages in the country. Not just competent, brilliant. The kind of young engineer who saw what was wrong with an engine before the diagnostic software could print a readout. He had designed a variable compression intake system at 29 years old that his employer had promptly filed under the company's name. When Ethan raised the issue, he was told he had signed a contractor agreement. When he pushed harder, he found himself out of a job, out of his savings, and facing a civil suit he could not afford to fight. The bankruptcy came 18 months later. He lost his workshop, his tools, most of his equipment. What he kept was the knowledge, and a very specific way of looking at machines that most people had spent their entire careers not learning. The DB5 arrived at the Hargrove lot on a Tuesday morning in mid-October, towed in on a flatbed from an estate sale in Scottsdale. The deceased owner had been a collector of moderate reputation, a man who acquired interesting things and rarely talked about where they came from. The DB5 was logged into the system as Lot 741. Make, Aston Martin. Model, DB5. Year, 1964. Condition, non-running. Estimated value, scrap. The garage manager, a heavyset man named Donnie, took one look at it and told the driver to park it in the back corner. Donnie had been in the business long enough to know what a dead car looked like, and this one was textbook. Burned-out engine, corroded wiring, one rear quarter panel nearly collapsed. He flagged it for disposal and moved on to the Porsche 911 inches Bay 2, which was worth considerably more of his attention. Ethan noticed the car the morning after it arrived. He was wheeling a mop bucket past the back of the lot when the edge of the tarpaulin caught a draft and lifted, just for a second. What he saw stopped him cold. He set down the bucket. He walked over. He crouched. He pulled the tarpaulin back from the hood and looked at the car the way a doctor looks at a patient, not in a hurry, not with assumptions, but with attention. The bodywork was rough. The engine bay was a disaster. But Ethan was not looking at any of that. He was looking at the VIN plate on the driver's side door frame. He read the number twice. Then he looked at the plate on the firewall. The numbers did not match. Not by much, 2 digits transposed, but enough to mean something if you knew what you were looking for. He leaned in further and found the carburetor. Someone had hand-tuned it. Not factory, not aftermarket. Handmade adjustments, filed down with a tool that left marks Ethan had not seen since he studied engineering at a garage in upstate New York, run by a man who had worked on European race cars in the early 1970s. He stood up. He looked at the car for a long moment. Then he noticed something beneath the dust on the front grille, a small stamp, almost invisible, pressed into the metal just below the Aston Martin badge. A bird in profile, wings angled slightly downward. He had seen that symbol exactly once before, in a photograph tucked into a technical manual he had studied as a young engineer. He had not thought about it in years. Ethan walked back inside and found Donnie at the front desk. He told him he wanted to buy lot 741. Donnie blinked at him. Ethan repeated it. $1,000. Cash. His entire savings, every dollar he had put aside over the last 2 years, living on a janitor's salary and spending almost nothing. Donnie stared at him for a moment, then shrugged and said he would need to check with the owner. The owner of Hargrove Premier Auctions was not in the building that morning, but when he heard the offer by phone, he laughed and said yes immediately. $1,000 for a piece of scrap he was going to pay to have hauled away. He told Donnie to draw up the paperwork. Word spread through the garage by noon. By 2 in the afternoon, the mechanics in Bay 1 had gathered to look. They were not unkind men, but they were not thoughtful ones either, and the sight of the quiet janitor loading a ruined Aston Martin onto a borrowed trailer struck them as genuinely funny. One of them took a photograph. Another one filmed a short video on his phone. They called it the biggest waste of $1,000 they had ever seen. Ethan hitched the trailer to his old pickup truck, settled the tow straps, and drove away without saying a word. He did not know that Victoria Kane was in the parking lot when he pulled out. Victoria Kane was 35 years old, and she had been running Hargrove Premier Auctions for 4 years. Before Hargrove, she had built her reputation at 2 other houses on the East Coast, moving through the industry with an aggression that people found either impressive or deeply unpleasant depending on how close they were to her orbit. She was tall, always composed, and dressed in a way that said money without saying it loudly. She had an eye for value, genuine, refined, and fast. In a room full of collectors and billionaires, she could identify the 3 people whose opinions actually mattered and ignore everyone else. That gift had made her very successful very quickly. It had also made her very certain that she understood the value of things. She understood people the same way she understood auction lots. She assessed them quickly, assigned them a tier, and treated them accordingly. Ethan Cole had been assigned a tier a long time ago. He was the man who swept the floors. She had perhaps spoken 15 words to him, total in the 18 months, since she had been assigned the Phoenix branch. When she was in the building, he was invisible. That was the natural order of things, as she understood it. She had come to the lot that afternoon to check on a consignment of 3 classic Ferraris due for the upcoming fall catalog. She was standing outside the main entrance, reviewing photographs on her phone, when Ethan drove past her, the ruined DB5 strapped to the trailer behind his pickup. She looked up. She saw what was on the trailer. She looked at the man driving. Something about the combination struck her not as interesting, but as absurd. She stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said. Ethan stopped the truck. Victoria walked to the edge of the parking lot. She looked at the car on the trailer. She looked at Ethan. "You bought that," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Ethan said. She studied him for a moment. Behind her, 3 of the garage mechanics had followed her out. The afternoon was bright, and there were a dozen other staff visible through the glass of the main building. Victoria had an instinct for an audience. She had built her entire career on knowing when one was watching. "You actually think you can fix it," she said. "A car that the entire industry has written off." She smiled. It was a precise smile, calibrated. A janitor, fixing an Aston Martin. She paused to let that land. "I've heard some delusional things in this business. This might be the top of the list." The mechanics laughed. Someone behind the glass gave a thumbs up. Victoria held Ethan's gaze. Ethan looked back at her for exactly 2 seconds. Then he released the parking brake and drove out of the lot. Victoria watched him go. Then she turned to one of the mechanics and said, "Get that on video next time. People love a good tragedy." She walked back inside and returned to the photographs of the Ferraris. She did not think about it again. The short clip one of the mechanics had filmed that afternoon went up online that evening. The caption read, "Local janitor drops his entire life savings on a dead Aston Martin. Stay tuned for the disaster." It got significant traction within 24 hours. People in car forums picked it up. Automotive enthusiast pages shared it with commentary ranging from amused to contemptuous. Nobody rooted for the janitor. The consensus was that it was a sad story about someone who did not understand their own limits. Ethan did not see any of it. He was already in his garage. The garage where Ethan rented space was a single-bay unit on the edge of an industrial park in Tempe. The roll-up door had a bent track that made it stick 2 feet from the ground. The fluorescent light above the workbench flickered every 20 minutes with a soft electrical buzz. The floor was cracked concrete with an oil stain in the center that predated Ethan by at least 15 years. He paid $320 a month for it, and he had turned it into the most organized workspace a man with almost no money could manage. His tools were clean. His storage was precise. His workbench had the kind of order that spoke of someone who had once worked at a higher level and had kept the habits. He spent the first 2 days doing nothing but documenting. He photographed every panel, every component, every connection point. He ran a numbered tag system on every bolt he removed. He filled 3 notebooks with observations, not diagnoses, just descriptions. Where the rust was, where the metal was sound, which welds were original and which were replacements. He found the burned-out engine block and confirmed it. The damage was real, extensive, and deliberate. Not a mechanical failure. Someone had run the engine with no oil at sustained high RPM. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what it would accomplish. The engine had been murdered. On the 3rd day, he found the compartment. It was beneath the driver's seat, concealed behind a false panel in the floor rail, not factory, but built with enough care and age that it had become invisible to anyone who had not been specifically looking for it. Ethan found it by feel, running his fingers along the rail while tracing the body structure. The latch was a small magnetic catch. He pressed it. The panel released. Inside, sitting on a small piece of aged foam rubber, were 3 objects. The first was a pocket watch brass casing, stopped at 1147. Its surface worn smooth. The second was a small brass key, simple, no identifying marks. The third was a photograph, black and white, printed on paper that had gone the color of old bone. The car in the photograph was unmistakably this car. Same body profile, same wheel arches, the same faint bird stamp visible on the grille. Behind it, in the background, was a track. And above the track, on a banner strung between 2 poles, were the words, "Le Mans, 1964. Ethan sat on the cold concrete with the photograph in his hands for a very long time. He had heard of Project Black Swan. Every engineer who had ever worked in the world of vintage British performance cars had heard of it. The way you hear of things that exist mostly as rumor, a name passed around at trade shows, mentioned in footnotes, occasionally surfacing in the more obsessive corners of automotive history. The project, as the story went, was a development program run quietly inside Aston Martin in the early 1960s, aimed at producing an experimental chassis variant with a hand-built V12 configuration that preceded the standard factory models by nearly a decade. The program was shut down before completion. 2 prototype cars were built. One was destroyed in a fire at the factory in 1965. The other was never accounted for. Ethan turned the photograph over. On the back, in ink that had faded but was still legible, someone had written, "Do not let them bury it." He set the photograph down. He looked at the engine bay. He thought about the deliberate damage. He thought about the mismatched VIN plates not forged, just transposed. The kind of thing that would pass casual inspection but redirect serious inquiry. He thought about someone who had wanted to hide a car without destroying it, who had concealed the compartment, documented its history, and then arranged for it to disappear into the world as a dead car, waiting. He picked up his notebook and wrote one line. This car was hidden on purpose. Then he went back to work. The parts he needed did not exist on any standard shelf. The engine configuration was unlike anything currently in production, and several of the components he needed to rebuild the block were either discontinued entirely or available only through specialist suppliers who dealt in quantities that required references and established accounts, neither of which Ethan had. He made a list. He called every supplier he could find. He explained what he was working on as carefully as he could, without revealing what the car actually was, which meant that to every person he called, he sounded like either a dreamer or a liar. Most of them did not call back. He did not know why the suppliers had suddenly stopped responding. He did not know that Victoria Kane had made several calls of her own. It had begun with the mechanic who had gone back through the auction records and found the original lot description. He had mentioned it to a colleague, who had mentioned it to someone at a parts supplier as a funny story. Victoria heard the name of the car, DB5, Project Black Swan, and something in her memory stirred. She had read a piece in an industry journal 2 years ago about the Black Swan prototypes. She had filed the information away with the kind of instinct that made her very good at her job. Now she pulled it back out and looked at it carefully. She was on the phone within the hour. She did not threaten the suppliers. She did not need to. In the tight world of classic car parts and restoration, Victoria Kane's approval could open doors, and her disapproval could close them. She simply made it known in the elegant, deniable way she had perfected over years that the supply requests coming from a garage in Tempe were not to be fulfilled. She framed it as a courtesy warning. The man making the requests was known to be operating without proper licensing. It was almost certainly untrue. It was the kind of thing that was very hard to disprove, once said. When Ethan's calls stopped being returned, he spent 2 days assuming the problem was his approach. Then he changed his approach, and the calls still were not returned. Then he spent an afternoon thinking very carefully. He had been in the industry long enough to recognize a closed door. He had also been shut out of an industry once before, and he remembered what it felt like. He set his jaw and changed his plan. He would make what he could not buy. The lathe in his garage was old, a machine he had acquired piece by piece from an estate sale and an online auction, rebuilt from components that had no business being in the same room together. It worked. It was not fast, and it was not precise by modern standards, but Ethan's hands were fast and precise. And together they managed. He worked through the nights for 5 days. He made the components he needed from billet stock he sourced from a metal supplier in Chandler, who had no connection to the classic car world and no idea what he was looking at. He tapped threads by hand. He hand-fitted tolerances. His fingers were burned twice by machine oil and once by a poorly placed heat gun. He did not stop. On the 6th night, at 11:45, the power went out. He sat in the dark for a moment. He found his phone and turned on the flashlight. Then he found the old emergency lantern he kept on the shelf above the door, a battery-powered unit that cast a flat white light across the garage. He went back to work under the lantern. At 2 in the morning, a car pulled up outside. He heard the roll-up door shake. He ignored it. At 2:15, someone knocked on the side door. He put down his tools and went to the door. The man outside was in his late 70s. Tall, lean, with a face that had been deeply weathered by decades outdoors. He wore a canvas jacket and held a flat cap in both hands. His name was Harold Briggs. He was the retired owner of a specialty restoration shop that had closed 8 years ago. He had heard about the work happening in the Bay through a former supplier contact who had found Ethan's parts requests interesting rather than suspicious, and had called Harold before calling anyone else. Harold Briggs had worked on British sports cars since 1961. He had the specific kind of knowledge that never gets written down. He stood in the doorway of the garage, looked at the DB5 on the lift, and went very still. "Can I come in?" he said. Ethan stepped aside. Harold walked around the car slowly. He said nothing for several minutes. He crouched near the front end and looked at the grill. He saw the bird stamp. He made a sound, not quite a word, not quite a breath. "I thought this car was gone," Harold said finally. Ethan watched him. "I worked at the factory," Harold said. 1963 to 66. Not on this project, I was on the standard DB line. But I knew the men who were on Black Swan. Good engineers. He paused. When the project ended, they were very careful to make sure none of the cars survived. Or so we were told. He straightened up and looked at Ethan. Where did you find it? End of a lot, Ethan said, flagged for scrap. Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he said, What do you need? Ethan told him. Harold went back to his car and returned with 2 cases. Inside them were tools that Ethan had not seen outside a museum, period-correct precision instruments from the 1960s, maintained with obsessive care. Harold set them on the workbench without ceremony. I won't be here every night, Harold said. My back isn't what it was. But I'll be here when I can. The engine block turned over for the first time, just a tremor, just a suggestion of combustion, not a real start on the morning of the 7th day. Ethan stood over it with both hands on the fender and felt the vibration travel up through the metal. Harold Briggs, sitting on a folding chair in the corner, looked at the engine and smiled for the first time since he had walked through the door. While Ethan worked, the online commentary about him grew louder. The original clip had been followed by several others' footage, compiled by automotive bloggers who had tracked down the story. The narrative was consistent, a delusional janitor wasting his last dollar on a fantasy. Victoria Kane did nothing to discourage the attention. At an industry luncheon in Scottsdale, when someone raised the subject half laughing, half curious, she shook her head slowly and said, This is what happens when people don't understand their place in the chain. Several people at the table laughed. Someone filmed her saying it. That clip also went around. One of the people who saw the original footage was a man named Marcus Webb. Marcus ran one of the better-regarded automotive history blogs in the country, not large by mass media standards, but deeply trusted within the collector community. He covered provenance disputes, restorations, and the occasional fraud case. When he saw the clip of the Janitor and the DB5, he clicked on it for the same reason everyone else did, to enjoy the irony. Then he watched it again more slowly. Then he looked at the license plate on the trailer. Then he spent 45 minutes with a magnifying glass and the best still image he could extract from the footage, looking at the rear quarter panel of the car. He drove to Tempe the following Saturday morning. Ethan heard the car pull up outside and went to the roll-up door. Marcus Webb was younger than his writing suggested, mid-30s, with the slightly disheveled look of someone who spent most of their time reading. He introduced himself. He showed Ethan his press credentials. He said he had some questions about the car and wanted to be straightforward about why. Ethan looked at him for a moment, then opened the door wider. Marcus walked around the car the same way Harold had, slowly, without speaking, absorbing. He was not a mechanic and he knew it. But he had spent enough years in the collector world to know what he was looking at in general terms. And what he was looking at made his thinking accelerate in a way it rarely did. He asked Ethan about the VIN discrepancy. Ethan explained what he had found. Marcus asked about the condition of the engine before the rebuild. Ethan described the deliberate damage. Marcus asked about the compartment. Ethan showed him the photograph. Marcus Webb sat down on the edge of Ethan's workbench and stared at the photograph for a long time. I want to be honest with you about something, Marcus said. I came here to write a piece about how this story is what happens when enthusiasm outpaces knowledge. That was going to be the angle. He paused. I don't think that's the right angle anymore. What do you think the right angle is? Ethan asked. Marcus looked at the car. I think I need to go look at some records, he said. It took Marcus Webb 4 days of research, cross-referencing factory records, period photographs, race documentation, and 2 conversations with an archivist at a British automotive museum to confirm what the photograph in the hidden compartment had suggested. The car on Ethan's lift in the industrial park in Tempe was, with a very high degree of probability, the second prototype from Project Black Swan. The car that had officially never been accounted for, the car that certain very serious collectors had spent decades and significant resources trying to locate. When he found the production number embedded in the engine block specifications, a sequence Ethan had not known to look for, but which Harold Briggs had identified from memory, the probability stopped being a probability. Marcus published his findings in 2 parts. The first part laid out the historical research. Project Black Swan. The 2 prototypes. The documented fate of the first car. And the absence of any credible record for the second. He was precise and careful, and he cited everything he could cite. The second part was about the car in Tempe, and about the man who had found it. He wrote about Ethan Cole the way a good writer writes about a person who has earned attention, without condescension, without exaggeration, with respect for the specific kind of intelligence that expresses itself through a person's hands rather than their credentials. The piece went through the collector community like a current. Within hours, it had been shared and discussed in every serious automotive forum. Within a day, it had reached the mainstream automotive press. Within 2 days, it had reached outlets with no automotive focus at all. The story had everything: a lost legend, a hidden secret, a man who had been dismissed and mocked, and a car that the establishment had condemned that turned out to be extraordinary. Victoria Kane saw the article on a Tuesday morning, and for the first time in 4 years of running Hargrove, she felt something she did not know how to categorize. It was not quite fear. It was the particular discomfort of someone who has bet heavily on a wrong read. She called her assistant and told him she needed to reach Ethan Cole. The assistant came back an hour later and said that Ethan had declined to take the call. Victoria tried a different approach. She had a lawyer draw up an offer letter. $500,000 for the car, as is, no conditions. She sent it by courier to the garage in Tempe. Ethan received it on a Wednesday afternoon, read it once, and set it on the workbench. He went back to the engine. That evening, he wrote back a single sentence. "The car is not for sale." Victoria read his response the next morning. She stared at it for a while. Then she set it down and made a different kind of call. The men she hired were not professionals in the formal sense. They were 2 individuals who were good at being where they were not supposed to be, and who understood that they were being paid to discourage rather than destroy. The instruction was specific. Set back the work. Damage the fuel system. Make it look like a break-in for insurance purposes. They arrived at the garage at 12:40 in the morning. They were quiet, and they were quick. They disconnected the fuel line from the rebuilt carb assembly and bent the primary feed tube, a clean, targeted action that would have been invisible to anyone who did not know exactly what they were looking at. Then one of them kicked over the auxiliary fuel container near the back wall and, in a moment of carelessness that had not been in the brief, the liquid reached the old fluorescent ballast housing above the workbench. The short was immediate. The fire started small and moved fast along the wood of the workbench edge. Harold Briggs was asleep on the folding cot he had taken to keeping in the garage on nights, when his back made the drive home seem unreasonable. He woke to the smell and was on his feet before he was fully conscious. He got the hand extinguisher off the wall and put the fire out before it reached the tools. His right forearm was burned. Not seriously, he would need treatment but not a hospital stay. He called Ethan from the garage floor, sitting on the concrete with the extinguisher in his good hand. Ethan arrived at 1:15 in the morning. He stood in the doorway and looked at what had been done. The workbench was a ruin. 2 of the hand tools Harold had lent him were heat-damaged. The fuel system they had spent 3 days setting up correctly was a mess of bent metal and lost work. The DB5 itself was physically unharmed. The fire had not reached the car, but the floor around it was scorched and the air smelled of accelerant. Ethan stood there for a very long time without moving. Harold watched him from the folding cot, with his arm wrapped in a dish towel. Outside, the industrial park was silent and dark. Ethan said, "How bad is your arm?" Harold said it was manageable. Ethan nodded. He walked to the DB5. He put his hand on the hood. He stood there with his palm flat on the cold metal for almost a minute. Then he picked up his notebook from the floor where it had fallen, checked that it was undamaged, and sat down on an overturned crate. "Tell me what we lost," he said. Harold told him. Ethan wrote it down. Then they went through what was left. Marcus Webb published a third piece 3 days after the fire. He had spoken to Ethan by phone, a brief conversation, factual, Ethan giving him only what he had confirmed, and he wrote it the same way he wrote everything, with precision and without dramatics. But the facts themselves were dramatic enough. Someone had broken into a garage where a man was restoring one of the most historically significant automobiles in the world and had deliberately set back his work. The arson investigators' report, which Marcus had obtained through a public records request, noted evidence of accelerant and classified the fire as suspicious in origin. Marcus did not name Victoria Kane. He did not need to. He laid the facts in sequence and let his readers draw the line. The response was substantial. The collector community, which had spent the previous 2 weeks enjoying the story as entertainment, shifted register entirely. Restoration specialists began reaching out to Ethan, directly offering tools, parts, labor, contacts. 2 vintage parts dealers who had previously been unavailable suddenly returned his calls. A machinist in Scottsdale, with a full precision lathe, offered him unlimited shop time at no cost. The industry, which had laughed at him, was now watching with something very different, not quite guilt, but a kind of heightened attention that contains its own accountability. Ethan accepted the help that was practical and declined the rest. He did not hold press conferences. He did not give interviews. He returned to the garage and went back to work. Harold's arm healed. The fuel system was rebuilt in 60 hours. The engine came back together, component by component, the way a complex sentence comes together word by careful word, each piece dependent on the ones before it, until there is something whole. On the morning of a Sunday in late November, Ethan stood beside the rebuilt engine in the fully assembled car, key in hand, and looked at Harold sitting in his chair in the corner. Harold looked back at him. Ethan got in the car. He sat for a moment in the cracked leather of the driver's seat. Then he put the key in. He turned it. The V12 engine started on the 3rd crank. The sound it made was not the polite purr of a restored vehicle. It was a sound from another era, entirely a deep, mechanical authority that filled the single-bay garage from floor to ceiling and vibrated in the chest like a physical thing. It ran rough for 30 seconds, then smoothed as the rebuilt carburetor found its calibration. Harold Briggs put his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. He was not a man who cried easily, and he was not crying now exactly, but he was something close to it, and Ethan understood that perfectly. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived from the International Classic Automobile Exhibition, the most prestigious vintage car event in the country, held annually in Los Angeles. Inside was a formal invitation for Ethan to bring Lot 741 to the exhibition for display. The invitation had the letterhead of the exhibition's chief curator. It was addressed to Ethan Cole by name. Marcus Webb had made a few calls. The morning Ethan drove the DB5 to Los Angeles, he had not painted it. He had not repainted the exterior. He had repaired the structural damage, replaced what was irreparable, and polished the chrome to a respectable state. But the silver paint was original aged, marked with the history of the car's long concealment, and he had made the decision to leave it that way. Some of the other exhibitors, arriving with their immaculate restorations and full concours-level finishes, watched him pull into the venue and looked at each other with expressions that ranged from puzzled to quietly superior. An attendant, who did not know the car's provenance, directed him to a back-row position. The exhibition hall was housed in a converted aircraft hangar. It had the particular atmosphere of those spaces, large enough to make everything inside feel both significant and small at the same time. The attending collectors and enthusiasts that morning included several individuals whose net worth could have purchased every car in the building multiple times over. It was not a world that responded well to humility. It was a world that responded to money, condition, and documentation. On the first 2, Ethan was clearly outmatched. On the third, he had a manila envelope in the car's door pocket. And what was in that envelope was enough to reframe everything else. Victoria Kane arrived at 10:15, accompanied by 3 members of her team and a photographer. She wore a cream suit and carried herself with the unhurried confidence of someone who does not need to announce their arrival. She had heard about the invitation through the industry grapevine and had made a call to secure her own presence. The exhibition organizers, who knew her well and valued her business relationships, had arranged a prominent position near the front of the hall for a Ferrari GTO she had brought on consignment. She accepted this as appropriate. She saw the silver DB5 parked in the back row when she was making her circuit of the hall. She stopped walking. She studied the car for a moment, and then she looked for Ethan. He was standing beside the car, talking quietly with Harold Briggs. He was wearing the same gray work shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow. Victoria walked over with her team behind her. She stopped in front of the car. She looked at the unrestored paint, the aged exterior. She looked at the scratches, the marks, the general appearance of a car that had lived through things. She looked at Ethan. She smiled. "I have to say," she said, loudly enough for the small cluster of people who had begun to pay attention, "I've seen some bold choices in my career. Bringing a car that looks like this to an event like this is certainly a choice." She gestured at the exterior with one hand. "If this is what 11 months of work produces, I think the industry can breathe easy. We're not in any danger." Several people laughed. Her team laughed. "I hope," she continued, "that this is at least a teachable moment. Some things cannot be saved. Some people are not equipped to save them. It's not a character flaw, it's just reality." Ethan looked at her. He had nothing to say. He turned and opened the driver's door and got in. The chief curator of the exhibition had been standing near the center of the hall. He had come over when he recognized the car. He spoke briefly to the exhibition floor manager, who stepped forward and announced that the demonstration component of the morning's program was beginning, and that exhibitors with running vehicles were invited to start their engines. The hall went quiet in the specific way that large spaces go quiet when everyone in them is paying attention. Ethan sat in the driver's seat. He did not look at Victoria. He did not look at the crowd. He looked forward through the windshield at the concrete floor of the hangar and at the light coming in through the high windows. He put his hand on the key. He turned it. The engine spoke. Not started spoke. The V12. Hand rebuilt in a single-bay garage in Tempe with damaged tools and salvaged components, and 2 years of stored knowledge applied in 11 months of disciplined work, produced a sound that was categorically different from every other engine running in that hall. It was the sound of something that had not been heard in 6 decades. Raw. Mechanically honest. A voice from 1964 that had somehow survived everything that had been done to silence it. The hall went still. Victoria Kane's smile stopped. Near the front of the crowd, a man in his late 60s with the particular contained posture of someone who has spent their life trying not to draw attention, stepped forward. His name was Dr. James Hartwell. He had been the leading archivist of British performance car heritage for the last 30 years and was the closest thing the industry had to an institutional memory. He had spent a portion of that career on the incomplete file of Project Black Swan. He pushed through the gathering crowd to the front of the car, crouched, and looked at the grille. He saw the bird stamp. He stood up. He looked at the engine still running through the open hood. Ethan had left it open for the demonstration, deliberately, so it could be heard and seen. Hartwell looked at the top of the engine block and found the production sequence number Harold Briggs had identified. His mouth opened. He pressed his hand flat against the fender. His eyes went bright. He had been in this industry for 30 years. He was not a man who cried easily. He turned to the curator beside him and said, in a voice loud enough to carry, "This is the Black Swan." What followed was not the dignified, orderly process one might expect from a venue full of professionals. It was closer to the particular chaos of people who have spent years holding a controlled and careful posture, suddenly finding that the ground beneath them has shifted. Hartwell confirmed the car's identity from the production sequence, from the carburetor configuration, from the chassis geometry, each point corroborated by his 30-year knowledge of the incomplete record. He produced photographs from his own archive, accessed on his phone, that matched the car panel for panel. He called 2 colleagues on the floor, who called 2 more. Within 20 minutes, there were a dozen recognized authorities crowded around the DB5, and every one of them had arrived at the same conclusion. The car was assessed informally at the scene, not a binding appraisal, but the kind of consensus number that carries weight in any subsequent formal process. The figure that circulated through the hall, and then through the industry, and then through the financial press, was $28 million. Not because any single person had the authority to make that determination final, but because everyone in that hall, looking at the documentation and the car and the history, understood that 28 million was probably conservative. Ethan stood beside the car while this happened. He did not perform. He answered questions when asked. He showed the photograph from the hidden compartment. He showed the brass key. He showed his rebuild notebooks, 3 volumes of precise, dated documentation. Hartwell, who had been observing Ethan as carefully as he had been observing the car, pulled him aside at one point and said, "The level of work here is extraordinary. The rebuild. The documentation. Who taught you?" Ethan thought about it. "My father," he said, "and a man named Harold Briggs." Harold Briggs, still sitting on his folding chair he had brought it from Tempe, raised his flat cap when he heard his name. Victoria Kane had not left the hall. She stood at the edge of the crowd, no longer the center of it, watching the scene around the DB5 with an expression that had been very carefully set to neutral. Her team stood behind her, not certain what posture to assume. Her photographer had stopped taking pictures. The coverage of the day would not be the kind of coverage she had imagined when she arrived. She approached Ethan when the initial wave of experts and journalists had pulled back slightly. She did it alone, without her team, which was not how she usually did things. She stopped in front of him. She looked at the car. She looked at him. "You won," she said quietly. Her voice had lost the calibration. Ethan looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "I just didn't quit." He said it simply. Not as a performance, not for the crowd. As a statement of exactly what had happened. Victoria did not respond. She turned and walked back toward the main entrance. Her team fell in behind her. At the door, she stopped for a moment and looked back at the DB5 one final time. Then she walked out into the Los Angeles morning. A man was standing at the edge of the crowd, not one of the experts, not press. Older, in his early 60s, with the build of someone who had spent decades in physical work, he had a quiet and watchful face. He had been there for much of the demonstration and had said nothing. When the crowd around Ethan thinned, the man stepped forward. "You don't know me," he said, "but I knew the project." Ethan looked at him. "There's something you should understand," the man said. "This car, the value people are putting on it today, that's real. But it's not what matters most about what you've done." He paused. The engineer who built the V12 configuration on this prototype, his name was removed from the project records when the program was shut down. There was a corporate dispute. The company settled it by erasing the individual. It happens. He looked at Ethan steadily. "What you've done here is more than a restoration. You've put something back in the record that someone spent a great deal of effort removing." Ethan was very still. The man reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. It was a photocopy, aged, dense with text, and at the top was a project heading, "Black Swan Engineering Primary Systems Design." At the bottom was a list of credited engineers. One name had been redacted with black ink on the original. On this copy, someone had written the name back in pencil, in the margin, E. Cole. Ethan looked at the document for a long time. "I've been working on this for a while," the man said, waiting for the right moment. He looked around the hall at the crowd, at the car, at the cameras. This seemed like it. The confirmation came formally 3 weeks later. Aston Martin's Heritage Division, after reviewing Hartwell's findings and the documentation Ethan had produced, issued a public statement acknowledging the Black Swan prototype and its recovery. The statement referenced, in careful institutional language, a historical administrative error in the project's engineering credits, and confirmed that a correction had been filed with the relevant records. It was not an apology in the sense that the word is usually used, but it said Ethan Cole's name in the right context. And in that industry, in that world, that was not a small thing. They invited him to Newport Pagnell. They offered him a formal role. a consultancy, a title, a salary that would have been incomprehensible to the man who had been mopping floors at Hargrove Premier Auctions 18 months earlier. He flew to England for the meeting. He sat in the room and listened to what they were proposing. He thanked them. He flew home. He declined, not out of bitterness. Not because the offer was inadequate. He declined because he had thought carefully about what he wanted, and what he wanted was not the thing they were offering. The thing they were offering was a version of the world he had been forced out of once before, a world that made decisions by committee, that valued credentials over understanding, that would eventually need him to become someone other than himself. He had rebuilt something of great value in a single-bay garage with bent tools and a borrowed chair. And the experience had confirmed something he had known for a long time, but had pushed aside, that this was where he worked best. He renegotiated the lease on the Tempe garage to a longer term. He repaired the roll-up door track. He replaced the fluorescent light with something that did not flicker. He bought a second workbench. He took a precise and careful inventory of what equipment he had and what equipment he needed, and he made a list, and he worked through it methodically over the following months. He called the garage Cole Restoration. He built a modest website. He did not advertise beyond that. He did not need to. Marcus Webb had been writing about the garage since before it had a name. 3 months after the Los Angeles exhibition, Cole Restoration had a waiting list of 14 months. The inquiries came from collectors, museums, and estates-people with cars of significance that needed hands of equivalent significance. Harold Briggs came in 3 days a week. On the other days, Ethan was usually alone, or working alongside one of several young mechanics who had started showing up at the door, in the way that people show up when they have heard something worth showing up for. He was not a formal teacher. He did not give lectures or set curriculum. He worked, and they watched, and when they asked questions he answered them directly, with the particular patience of someone who had been the person in the room, who did not know yet, and remembered what that felt like. Victoria Kane resigned from Hargrove Premier Auctions 6 weeks after the Los Angeles exhibition. The official statement cited personal reasons. The actual reason was that the online record of the preceding year, the clips, the quotes, the captions, the luncheon footage had become impossible to manage. Investors who had been evaluating a potential acquisition of the Hargrove brand withdrew their interest. 2 major consignment clients chose other houses for their upcoming sales. The board, which had tolerated Victoria's approach when it produced results, found it somewhat less tolerable when it produced a significant public relations problem that showed no sign of resolving. She left with a settlement and a non-disclosure agreement and a deep and private reassessment that she would not have admitted to anyone, and that was, in its own way, more significant than anything the public record captured. She was at a dealer event in Scottsdale, some months later, a small, quiet gathering. Not the kind she used to anchor when someone showed her the cover of a restoration magazine. The cover photograph was the silver DB5, engine bay open, the V12 visible in its rebuilt form. In the background, out of focus, was Ethan Cole at his workbench. The headline read, "The car that changed everything." Victoria looked at the photograph for a long time. She said nothing to the person who had shown her. She handed the magazine back. She walked to the window of the event room and looked out at the parking lot for a moment. She was not a person who revisited things publicly, but something in the precision of what she was feeling told her it was not something she could simply set aside. She had spent her entire career knowing the value of things. She had believed, completely and without examination, that her ability to assess value was one of her defining strengths. She had looked at Ethan Cole and arrived at a number, the way she arrived at numbers for every lot and every person, and the number had been wrong. Not slightly wrong, categorically wrong, and the wrongness was not about the car. It was about the specific mechanism by which she had arrived at her assessment, the title, the appearance, a position, and the fact that she had trusted that mechanism without question because it had always worked before. She understood something that afternoon that she had not understood before, and the understanding was useful in the way that things are sometimes useful when they are painful. The value she had built her career on recognizing was always there in the object, waiting. It did not care whether she could see it. It did not care whether she called it worthless. It simply waited for someone who could. On a morning in early spring, Coal Restoration received a delivery. A vintage Italian sports car from a museum in New Mexico. Crated and wrapped with the kind of care that bespoke institutional anxiety, Ethan and Harold uncrated it in the garage. They spent the first 2 hours documenting. The roll-up door was open to the morning air. 2 young mechanics, a man of 24 named Patrick and a woman of 27 named Denise, worked on the far side of the garage on a separate job, asking questions in the careful and interested way they had learned to ask them. At noon, Ethan stepped outside for coffee. The industrial park was quiet. A thin cloud cover made the light flat and even. And everything in the lot, the gravel, the metal doors, the distant highway, had the particular clarity of a morning that has not made up its mind about itself. He set his coffee cup on the hood of his pickup truck. He looked back through the open door at the garage, at the cars, at the tools, at Harold reading something in his corner chair, at the 2 young mechanics working steadily and well. He thought about the year behind him. He thought about the year before that, and the years before that, and the whole long sequence that connected the garage. He was standing outside now to the moment when a tarpaulin had lifted in a breeze in a salvage lot, and he had gone still and looked and seen something that no one else had seen. He walked back inside. He picked up his notebook. He went to the Italian car on the lift and began, carefully and without hurry, from the beginning. A little later, Patrick looked up from his bench and asked about the bird stamp on the DB5's grill. He had seen a photograph of it in the magazine article and wanted to know what it meant, where it came from. Ethan thought about it for a moment. He went to the shelf where he kept the photograph from the hidden compartment. He had framed it, not prominently, just at eye level above the workbench. He looked at it briefly. It was a marking for a project that the people in charge decided wasn't worth continuing, he said. They thought the idea was dead. He picked up his wrench. They were wrong about what dead means. Patrick nodded and went back to his work. Ethan turned back to the car on the lift. He ran his hand along the fender, that particular motion, palm flat, unhurried, the way he always began, and then he put his hands to work. Outside, the morning held its silence. The highway hummed at a distance. The light through the high windows moved in its slow and patient way across the floor of the garage, across the tools, across the cars, across everything in the room that was worth understanding, and some things that only one person in that room yet knew how to see.